Riley, and I'm from Maryland, but sometimes I fly to the West Coast to see my relatives. When I'm flying across the country looking out the window of the plane, I can see a lot of pretty boring farmland. I can get why a lot of people call it flyover country. What or who down there could possibly interest me? Well, I recently spent a week here in Cheyenne County, Kansas. Long story. My stay has totally changed my mind about the region. I actually got to meet some of the people that do live here and listen to their stories. I learned that in the late 19th century, hundreds of thousands of Germans who had long lived in the Ukraine were being forced out of their country. Many came to the U.S. to build a life free of persecution. A lot of them came to the Midwest to get free land under the Homestead Act. And a good number of those people chose right here, Cheyenne County, Kansas, as their place to start over. Lucille Price's grandparents were among them.
My great-grandmother was a Wiest, and they came over and they built a house on Webster, just off of Main Street, and many people that came from the other country would stop at their house first. Then, of course, their daughter married a miller, and they farmed and then moved to town in about 1930 into a beautiful home on Spencer. But they always enjoyed showing people that were new to the country, throw out the welcome mat. My parents were Henry Miller and Lena Slepp Miller, and she came from Russia when she was 6 years old. So this was all strange to her. My dad helped build a church, and my parents were married in that church in 22, and I was baptized in German. I was confirmed in the German language there, but that was the last. Apparently I had something to do with it. This is not going to happen again. No more German confirmation. I felt like I had to learn the English language and what was there for those that knew the English language. I was the oldest of the 5 in my family, and I said, no more speaking German in this house. And my little sister never learned the German language. It made a difference. We had wheat crop, we had milo, we had corn. I did some corn shucking. Also took the truck out and would get some grain on the truck and bring it home and drive it into the garage and always hoped that there would be grassland. We always had milk and eggs. And when we got a hailstorm, well, my dad would say, gather up the hails and we'll go make ice cream. I remember meeting other friends in town on Saturday night. My mother would get the groceries at the store. I remember gathering on the corners, clusters of farmers visiting in the German language. There were, of course, the Boardmans down on the end there, Harrison's, Nixon's store, Thompson's pharmacy, and we were lucky if we'd get to an ice cream cone at the drugstore. There was always a bakery, it seems like. They, of course, always enjoyed taking their cream and eggs to town on Saturday night, and that gave the family the income to purchase their groceries. The movie we'd go to on Saturday night, they had some silent screams, silent movies, and Mr. Rochon would go down and play his piano during the time that the movie was silent. They had some excellent baseball games, but we had to make our own in our family yard. You know, it wasn't for sure that I would get to go to high school. I was made to think I was a farm girl. I would know how to milk the cows and even help with the butchering. I had to fight my way to get to high school, and I was determined. Well, I knew when I went to high school that this was country girl and there was town girl, and it was hard. I suppose we did kind of cluster together, girls from the country, And of course the town girls would have been through all the schooling, and they were friends in high school. And I was born in January of 1922, and so I am more than 100 years now. I've celebrated my 100th birthday with lots of friends.
Wow, I loved the part where Lucille got everybody to speak English when she was just a teen. And now she's over 100. Another thing I learned, and I probably should have guessed, that farming and ranching are huge here in Cheyenne County. But those people need support. I heard the saying, during a gold rush, you want to be the one selling the shovels. Apparently that was the thinking that brought a man named DeRoy Danielson to this area.
Hey Penny, here we are in an old building that's been restored into an art gallery, but can you tell me a little bit about the history?
Oh, yes. To start off with, in 1887, a man named DeRoy Danielson arrived in Cheyenne County with the hopes of becoming a cattleman or cattle baron. But those days were soon over because settlers were coming in, they were homesteading land, breaking sod, putting up fences. So Mr. Danielson decided that he would start a hardware and implement store. And so that is what this building originally was built, was to be a hardware and implement store. So in 1895, with $200 in his pocket, he took the cattle train to Kansas City to buy inventory for his new store. He returned home with a train car load of merchandise and placed it in the small building he rented for $10 a year. Initially, the store had neither glass in the windows nor a lock on the door. Within a year, he made repairs and continued operating his business for 25 years. Mr. Danielson told a reporter from the Merchants Journal of Topeka when his gross sales grew to $5,000 a year within the first 3 years of business, he felt he had reached the pinnacle of human achievement in that latitude and longitude. Around 1920, Mr. Danielson bought 4 lots directly across from his old store to build his new store. And I believe it was like 6,000 square feet, so it's a pretty big building. To promote his business, Mr. Danielson ran a column of news in the local paper along with his regular advertising. His column carried news about local happenings and what various people were doing in the community. One of the Danielson columns from 1909, with the headline, "Handling Manure on the Farm," talked about the important uses of manure in farming. It ended with 4 methods of spreading manure, which included the use of a manure spreader, which could, of course, be purchased at Danielson's. The article went on to say that few tools on the farm paid a better investment. And so yes, and he did that for a number of years, and people really enjoyed not only his articles, but his advertising.
All of that without a marketing degree.
Oh, yeah, he just did it, on his own. And I mean, to run a huge hardware store, plus have to write for a newspaper column was pretty remarkable. And I know lots of people that live in St. Francis now, especially the older generation, remember this as a grand store. This is where you could buy, it was kind of the Walmart of everything. So it didn't just have hardware and implement, there were bicycles, there were dishes, art books, gift wrap. It was just a whole lot of wonderful things.
They had wonderful jewelry. Us girls always liked to go to the jewelry counter. And of course my brothers enjoyed the farm equipment that they had. They had it in that vacant lot next to the Danielson store.
A year before DeRoy Sr. died, his son, also named DeRoy, ran the store up until 1968 when he sold the business to the Faulkner family. The building sat abandoned for a number of years, so there was a nonprofit that decided to turn it into an art gallery. So from hardware and implement store to art gallery, we have 202 on Washington.
And it's been such a joy to restore this part of that 5,000 or 6,000 square feet into an art gallery.
It really is. And it really makes me happy because this building was not abandoned, but it was empty for a number of years. And now to see the restoration, we have the original floors, the ceiling tiles are just great. The 202 on Washington Committee has done an amazing job bringing this building back to life. We hope that you come and see us, and you'll be amazed at how this building has been transformed.
That's so cool. Old-time hardware store to modern art gallery? Who knew? Back home, I hear a lot about mega corporations buying up farmland and controlling our food supply in the US. I found out that that's not really the case here in Cheyenne County. Many of the farmers and ranchers are still working the land that their ancestors worked first. I met one of those guys, Tom Small.
My great-grandfather and grandmother, Novello and Andrew, moved here from Muscatine, Iowa. They started farming in Cheyenne County in 1890. Their acreage was just east of St. Francis. My grandfather came out south of St. Francis in the Lawn Ridge area and bought land and started farming out here. In 1920, when Grandpa and Grandma moved out south here, the quarter that they were on was in grass. So they broke that out. And they didn't own very much land at that time, but the land that they had, they would farm. Back then, it was the plow, and they would use listers to plant their corn. The corn was harvested by hand and put into corn cribs, and then later a crew would come through and shell the corn. They would keep the corn cobs for fuel and then feed the grain to the animals or sell it to make some money. In 1945, my mother and father moved here to this farm. We have farmed since then. I have a son, Matthew, and a grandson, Jordan, and Jordan is our 6th generation of Smolls that's farmed here in Cheyenne County. Back in grandfather's time, if they could get 20 to 30 bushels, they thought that was a wonderful crop. As years progressed, farming got a lot better for the land. Now we shoot for 60 bushel wheat, we shoot for 90 bushel milo, we shoot for 200 bushel corn on irrigation, and so that's kind of where we're at as far as farming goes right now. When I was farming as a young man, I can remember being out here on this field with the one-way, going around and around and around, and by evening you shut the tractor off and you could have jumped across what you farmed all day. Now we have machines that we pull behind 460 horse tractors that are 54 foot wide. We have a sprayer that's 120 foot wide. If the field's smooth, they can run along 14 mile an hour. They can spray 600 acres a day very easily. And of course, with all of that, the price has increased. A tractor back when I was young, maybe $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. Now $350,000. Maintenance is very important. An old piece of equipment is fine if it's maintained properly, and it'll do the job as a new piece of equipment. We also have a cow-calf operation on our farm, and that helps supplement our income. It helps us be more diversified. There's two things that farmers cannot control. One is the weather. We're at the mercy of the weather for basically everything. Day after day of 100 and 105 degrees and 30, 45 mile an hour wind, it just takes the life out of your crop. So that's why it's important agriculturally to make sure that you're farming properly. Make sure that you're keeping your weeds cleaned off of your field, because a weed in your field is like a weed in your garden. It's taking nutrients and it's taking moisture, and that's what your crop needs to grow. So the better that you can watch after that and make sure that they don't get away from you, the better chances you have to grow a crop. The other thing is markets. We have no control on what Russia is going to do in Ukraine. Why should that affect us? But it does. With farming here in Cheyenne County, it is the mainstay of the county. How we prosper is how the folks on Main Street prosper. When we get hailed out, those folks get hailed out. Because if we have the money, we spend it. We shop and support them as much as we can. When we have a bad year, unfortunately, those people have a bad year also. We have got an obligation as farmers to be stewards of the soil. What we have here, we may own it, but it's not our land. It's God's land. It's our grandchildren's land. And what's underneath it, the Ogallala Aquifer, that needs to be taken care of and not used up. So right now, the irrigation has gotten so much better. We have regulations on how much water we can pump each year. Our systems are better at watering with a lesser amount of water. But in the long run, in years to come, the Ogallala Aquifer, just like oil fields, gas fields, there's an end to all of this. We need to be smart enough to know that we have to stop before the end is here.
Same business, same family, 130 years. Another thing I found out was that education is really important to the residents of Cheyenne County. In the old days, a lot of families lived out in the country and didn't have access to the schools in town. So for most of the 20th century, the farm children were taught in one-room schoolhouses scattered all over the county. Barbara Ewing was a student in several of those tiny schools and later taught in them.
Like all the schoolhouses in the community, and I think if you check the record, there was about 72 rural schools, and they were all about the same. They were big white schools with lots of windows on the sides. They were just one big room and lots of desks. Some of the local teachers did have all the grades, but I never did have all grades in one school. It would be like you might have first and second, and then maybe fifth and sixth and eighth or something like that. We had a lot of snow then, and if it snowed too much, we couldn't have school unless we could get to the schoolhouse. And the rule was if we could get there and back, we could count it as a day taught. So we all rode horses to school through the snow that was knee-deep to the horses. The schools were heated with coal brought into the schoolhouse to the pot-bellied stove by bucket. So that was how we were pretty cold most of the time, but we would have our lessons right around that old stove to keep warm during bad weather. If they were naughty, I think I had a good method. I sometimes would put them, if maybe two would cause some trouble, I'd put two in each corner at the back of the room, in the corners of the school building, and they would have to sit there and think about why they were there. And then they would have to come and tell me what they were doing that was wrong before I would let them go back to their seat.
In the 1950s, Barbara Ewing was transferred to St. Francis Elementary, where she taught the first grade. She told me about one student she'll never forget.
Neva was the fifth child of a very poor family who had lost their mother, and the father was trying his best to raise the four boys and the sister Neva. The first day of school, Neva came to school, tattered clothes, smelling badly. Just everything was bad. She was a shivering, scared to death little girl. I went to the principal and I said, I've got to do something. And I asked him if I could ask the mothers to give me some clothing And I would take the first recess of every day and take Neva down to the shower room and get the old wash tub out, and I would give Neva a bath every day. And she had clean clothes because my children in my class were well-to-do children, basically, and their mothers were just overjoyed to give me clothing for that little girl. My students became very, very loving of Neva, and that was one of the most exciting years I ever taught school.
I know the family who adopted her were very, very good parents
yes.
to her.
Oh, wonderful
She had
people.
a wonderful home.
Yes.
But,
And she grew up in Goodland
yes.
with their daughter.
Yep.
And was valedictorian of their high school.
I've forgotten that.
Yes,
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 she
I
was.
was so happy about that.
Well, I think you also should be very proud of the things that you did for Neva.
Well, I'd rather be humble about it. She sure turned out well.
She did.
That story shows dedication way above the call of duty. No wonder the county has produced so many brilliant students. Now, every town needs houses for its residents to live in. I was told most of the very first homes in the 1880s were flimsy and temporary. But soon enough, more sturdy structures began to appear. I got a tour of many early houses still standing today. The Jakeway House was built in the original settlement of Wayno and moved to St. Francis in 1888. The Lawless House was built that same year. The Uplinger family built their home in 1901. And then there's 110 East Spencer, from around 1900. Kate and Carl Jenkins own it now and run it as a B&B.
And it was built by a banker. It was built by Farmer Shields. And Farmer Shields had all of the wood for the woodwork and so forth shipped in from his home state of Iowa. They just built incredible built-ins, 11.5-foot ceilings. He lived here with his wife for probably close to 10 years, and then he sold to another banker, which was Mr. and Mrs. Willits and their daughter. And they lived here until the early 30s. And at that point, they sold to the Hancock family. They lived here from probably 1933, 1934, till into the mid-70s. I remember walking past this house as a fourth grader. Mrs. Hancock was still living in the house at the time. 17 years ago, we bought the big house. The very first day we came over after we signed the papers, and I told Carl, I said, we just bought a house of woodwork. I think the thing that is so enchanting actually is realizing that a structure of this kind and of this style was made entirely without power tools. It was just a master craftsman.
I love houses with stairs, staircases, and I fell in love with it. I just love that staircase.
It wasn't our intention to have a bed and breakfast. We threw our hat in when the other bed and breakfast shut down, and we lost a motel here in town. And then it just progressed. It just grew and developed, and we enjoyed it so much. We have had people from all over the world, from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Poland, Spain. I do a lot of the baking, he does the cooking, and he's become very, very good at it. I set the table and the ambiance and decorate plates, and I just do the extras, and a lot of people take off and go for walks and enjoy the fact that we have a beautiful neighborhood. We have a nice town. It's a clean-cut town, and people are friendly, and I think they just get to experience a little bit of small town Mayberry. We're just very aware that we are in a very sweet spot of, life.
I know where I'm staying the next time I come to visit. At first glance, life in Cheyenne County is pretty great, but there are some rough spots too. The 1930s were especially challenging, starting with the onset of the Great Depression. This was particularly hard on the county's merchants. Don Boardman remembers the effect it had on his parents' men's clothing store.
We made it. He was conservative. He kept his bills paid. He had some bad experience early in his life, and he was careful, but he always said about the prices of things that it wasn't how much that item cost him, it was how much it would cost to replace it. So as prices were going down, he'd go down. But it was largely his management. And then he always said, well, nobody's ever run a business with any less overhead than I have. Because he didn't pay my mother anything. And she worked and did the altering, and he really had one fellow there helping him most of the time. And between the three of them, they could make it go.
As if the Depression wasn't enough to deal with, the Great Plains were hit with an ecological disaster known as the Dust Bowl.
All we had was chisels and discs, and that destroyed all the cover on top, so it left the ground exposed to wind, and that's why the 30s were so bad.
Well, I will always remember the day that the Dust Bowl rolled in at noon, and there was no more sunlight. It was like midnight. It was very scary. We didn't know what was happening. And Dad was out in the field someplace, and I didn't know whether he would find his way home. And Mother put a lamp in the window so he would have some direction where to get to home.
You'd see the thing rolling in, just like these big clouds, you know, a rain cloud. You could see it coming from, probably 20 miles.
After that, it seemed like there was dust storms every day. So much of the crops were planted but didn't come up because it was too dry.
You know, it got dark. I mean, it got dark some of those days. And
the chickens went to roost that last day at noon because they thought it was midnight.
there was no crops. Her money was pretty scarce. Mom was wondering how she was going to get money for groceries next week. So I remember I went out and got all my toys. I brought them in and I gave them to Dad, and I said, you can sell them. And he said, no, you keep your toys. They wouldn't bring enough to buy groceries. And nobody'd have any money to buy them. So
lots of farmers left because they thought there was better places to live than this.
Now we are using sprays. We use sweep machines, which leaves the cover on top of the ground.
These vastly improved farming practices have ensured that there have been no repeats of the huge dust storms since those days. Yeah, there was more chaos to come. A third disaster that hit Cheyenne County really hard was the Great Flood of 1935. The Republican River, now usually dry, overflowed its banks, creating this huge lake that destroyed crops and killed cattle.
I remember during the flood, everybody met at Tom's house, and then the county had a Caterpillar and then an old truck. And there was no bridge at that time. And the truck would come out, the Caterpillar pulled the truck across the road, or across the river, I mean, and then you went to town, and then when you were home, well, they took you back, and you took your groceries. And my brothers and sisters were all in town that night. They didn't get home till a couple of days later. They got in an airplane because they had some cattle down on the river, and Ed and Albert were worried about them, so they flew home, and then Albert rode a horse down there. Of course, the cows were all gone, you know, and he rode clear to Binkelman looking for them and never found a few, but not very many.
Good thing there hasn't been a flood, Great Depression, or Dust Bowl since. Or should we say yet? But even through those tough times, growing up here could still be wonderful. Like I heard from Elton Keller.
I'm Elton Keller. I was born in 1929. I was the only child that had a doctor there. That was Dr. Walls. My parents were John and Matilda Keller. They originally came from Germany, and they walked from Germany to Surata, which is 60 miles east of Odessa. Dad was from Surata. He did tell me this, that his mother died And his dad was an alcoholic, and he got put with a carpenter. He said, I was 12 years old when I went to that guy's place, and he said, and when I left, when the Wagner sent me enough money to come over, I whipped him. He said, because he didn't treat me very good. I said, you did? He said, yeah, I waited for that day for 10 years. They wanted him as a husband, I guess, for my mother, so they sent him money. Well, he was supposed to get off the train at Higler. He didn't hear him, he was asleep, so he got up to Brush. And they said Higler. And they said, no, you missed Higler, it was down that way. So he didn't have any money, so he herded sheep at Brush to get enough money to come back to St. Francis. And he said when he got to Higler and he said, Wagner's. And they said, that way. So he walked to their place. Then he worked at different places, and then he married my mother. Of course, I think that was the plan all the time. That's why they sent money over there for him to come. My folks done business in Higler all the time. There was nothing in St. Francis. They said you couldn't take a team and wagon up Main Street with a load of wheat. It was just sand, it's just sand. It never really come alive until they cemented the street. A lot of times he'd haul his wheat to St. Francis. And there's some pretty good hills down there. And he said the worst time he ever had was with a load of wheat with a team of horses, and you had brakes on the wagon. But you went, the cook's place, Royce's granddad, lived on the right, going down one of the biggest hills going out there. And he said the road went through his yard. And he said Mr. Cook raised a lot of hogs. And he said, those old hogs were laying out and in the road. And he said that was always scary going down there because a hog would jump out and scare my horses, and I was always afraid a hog was going to jump out and scare my horse. And then he said the worst part of it was going up the hill on the other side. And then he said he'd get to town, and a lot of times the elevators would be full, so they couldn't take his wheat, so he'd have to unhook his team and ride one of them, take them both home and leave the wagon there, and then the elevator would dump it later when the train come in. There was always wine served at every supper, meal, evening meal.
Was this common in your community?
Most all German families did that. There was an old guy by the name of Chris Hoffman. He made liquor down in the spring, down about 2 miles. I suppose my dad furnished the corn. I don't know that, but I always suspicioned that Dad ground the corn and took that down to him. And he made money because he had a new Chrysler in Dad's garage up at the house. They arrested him, and I looked up, my dad got arrested one time for making wine because John Endorf was the sheriff, who was a neighbor, who drank wine there with Dad many a times. And Dad was in town, and John met him on the street and said, John, I've got to come to your house. Somebody's turned you in. You've got wine in your cellar. And so he went to the phone and called my mother to get the wine out of the cellar because John Endorf's going to come and confiscate it and, of course, pour it out. So, of course, John knew it was there because he drank it. But anyway, Mom went down. None of the hired men or none of the kids were there, so she filled jars and got most of it outside. She put it away. She hid it.
Where did she hide it?
In the syringa bushes, that's lilac bushes. There was a bunch of lilac. They arrested Dad, and they took him to trial, and they charged him $50 fine and sentenced him to 30 days in jail. But they commuted the 30 days in jail, but he had to pay the $50 fine. we were kids in high school, and I know we would always want to get a bottle of beer, but you know, nobody would sell a kid a beer. But one day I said, I'm going to get a beer today. There was about 4 of us, and I walk up to Mr. Scobie. I knew it would cost 50 cents, and I had my 50 cents ready, and he just reached in there was a bottle, and he opened it up and banged it down on the counter, and I threw him the 50 cents and I left. And all those my friends, you got a beer? He give you beer? Yeah, he give beer. So there was little rooms, I don't know if you've ever been, but there's little rooms in the back, and he said, you kids get in the back. He didn't want anybody seeing me drinking beer. So they got pop, and they drank their pop, and I drank, and I wouldn't give them any. They wanted to let me taste some of it. No, you go get your own. The fair we had was behind the courthouse. There was no carnival. It was in that park behind the courthouse. And then a year or so after that, it got too big for that, and they had it up at the airport here. Everybody had smaller animals, had a calf. No big calves like they have now, or cows. It was 4-H projects, a lot of it. No big cows, because nobody wanted to get an old cow in here and tie him up to a tree or somewhere. The fair didn't come till 45, 48, right after the war. Money was a big thing in those days, I remember.
Yeah.
Nobody had much of it.
Thanks for all those stories, Elton. I am sure they're all true. It's true that some aspects of life here can seem a bit old-fashioned. Parades, fairs, and church events are all pretty much the same as they were all those years ago. But farming techniques? Now that's a different story. I found that many of the farmers are using cutting-edge technology with advanced agricultural techniques. One of those is Tim Riley.
This is a 5th-generation farm. My son came back to farm with me about 10 years ago to be the 5th generation. This farm was homesteaded in the late 1800s. It was homesteaded by proving up on the land, so you could get the quarter of land by building a home and a tree claim on it. In later years, you could also just get an additional quarter by proving up another quarter with just a tree claim, and then on the 3rd quarter, they actually purchased that. There was no resources out here, very little timber. So a lot of times they initially had to just dig a hole into the side of a mountain or a hill or an embankment, and that's where they lived that first year until they could actually get enough materials to build a house. And at that time there was very few resources to do that from, as far as businesses or lumber yards or anything like that. So a lot of times they just used what was handy, and the homestead house on this farm was built from rock and mud. And straw is how they built that, because there was no timber, or very minimal amount of timber in the area to be used. And the process of breaking sod in this area, most of it was initially done on good level ground in this prairie, and it was all native pasture. And so the action of the plowshare actually turned the soil upside down. They just kept tilling it and disking it until it became, with the topsoil, became good tillable soil to plant crops on. Our particular farm was all broke with a horse and plow. It took a long time to plow. Sometimes it would take a whole year to plow 80 acres. Initially, they started out with wheat and corn. Corn didn't last very long because it was such an arid part of the world, they discovered. So they found that this was a perfect area for hard red winter wheat. Hard red winter wheat is wheat that is planted in the fall and harvested in the following July. So it vernalizes over the winter, and it actually produces more through the vernalization process than it would if it was a spring planted crop. And this is what they were very familiar with, because this is what they were doing in the plains of Ukraine before they moved here. So they were very familiar with that process. They brought a hard red winter wheat called Turkey Red, and there's many varieties of wheat, but this happened to be one that seemed to be very winter tolerant at the time, that could overwinter well. and then it yielded well, and it also was a very tall wheat, so it covered the ground. The newer wheats that were all bred from Turkey Red were higher yielding, more disease tolerant, and shorter and easier to harvest. So all of our modern wheats today came from the Turkey Red wheat. This is a 1936 John Deere D tractor. My grandfather gave this and a tank of fuel to my dad to start farming in the late 40s. Well, in contrast to this tractor, the new modern tractors we use are much higher horsepower and can pull a lot larger equipment, and they're all computer driven, and they all have GPS guidance on them. So they actually have the capability of turning themselves around at the end of each field and to continue the passage through the field until the field work is done on that particular field. The engines are all controlled by computers for fuel efficiency, and they're all tied to the internet. So if our tractors are to break down, in real time, messages are sent to the dealerships, and they can tell us before we even know that there's a problem with the tractor. Yeah, my grandfather built that barn in 1923. This was the technology of the day. They filled the hay in through the door up on top, and then they would drop the hay down to the horses and the milk cows through the hay mounds on the sides. Here they had a state-of-the-art barn and lived in a rock and mud house. And this is my dad and my grandfather, and they're harvesting wheat. They would basically swat the wheat, and then they would load it up onto here. The stalks and the head went onto this trailer. This was my grandfather's blacksmith shop. They had very crude tools to pull the metal out, and they could bend it into shapes on the anvil. Our farm transitioned to organic about 6 years ago. We've chose that path. We just didn't feel like our current path of using chemicals was sustainable for our farm. As they say, what's old is new again. So we're farming in some ways like my grandparents farmed many years ago, but in a lot of ways we've taken that to a different level. We're doing a better job of soil health and protecting the soil than we did, and we're not putting artificial chemicals and fertilizers on our soil, which can really mess up the biologicals in the soil. We've learned to try to work with the soil rather than to force it into growing crops. So far, our yields have remained pretty stable from when we were conventional farmers. We're still fertilizing just as much as we were before, but we're using compost, and in some ways we're actually getting a better source of nitrogen and phosphorus because we're getting micronutrients with that, along with all the microbiology that comes with that helps break down the nitrogen and phosphorus that's already in the soil. Conventional fertilizers don't always do that. They overshadow those biologicals and sometimes destroy them. Now, all of our crops are sold directly to the mills or the processors. We no longer go through the cooperative systems and the local elevators. So as a organic farmer, quality means more to us than yields. And they want high protein, good test weights, and good milling quality, which some of the modern wheats aren't as good a milling quality. So we target varieties that are strictly have those attributes that we can take directly to the mill. I take it for granted because this is what all I've ever known. I started actually driving tractor when I was 10 years old. And so it was just very natural for me to come back to the farm. I did have aspirations to do other things. I went to college like most kids do, but the farm kept calling me back. And it's just such a great place to raise a family and having them be involved with you as you're growing the farm, it's just very rewarding.
That's incredible. I never thought they'd be doing organic farming all the way out here. All the people that we've met in this video are all folks that grew up and stayed here in Cheyenne County. But there were others that were born here and for one reason or another left. But it's safe to say that this part of the world never left them.
Well, I feel like I have a hometown. I feel like I know the little hometown church, the hometown store, the hometown swimming pool, my friends that I had. And I mean, the same night you'd ride in the same place every night, and everybody would be talking about this family and that house. You know, they'd know all the history of the families. And then we'd just do this, you know, we'd get a hot dog, get the Dairy King. But that's a wonderful sort of pattern to have as a child. So
Yeah, that's always been home to me. I've never had any other place. I've abided and lived in many places all over the world, but as far as home, that's home.